information sources in a post-truth era. The notion of topics such as fake news have been in the public eye in recent years, but librarians have taught information literacy concepts for decades. In connection with the Morlan Gallery exhibition Factitious, which explores the blurry line between fact and fiction, this talk will explore the long history of what we have come to call fake news, and will present strategies for evaluating information resources that can help educators and their students combat false and misleading information. Please hold your questions and comments until the end of the presentation. At that time, the chat function will be enabled and the presenters will indicate that you may use it. And now, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Jason Cooper and Anthony Mead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I just wanted to say from the beginning that while curating the Factitious exhibition, something that I knew was really important in the beginning was to bring in a conversation about evaluating source materials and this idea of what we've come to call the post-truth era, and bring that into the conversation. And luckily, our own Jason Cooper has spent a lot of time thinking through and researching that exact topic. And after I talked to Jason, something that became increasingly fascinating to me was the longevity of what is the post-truth era and this gray area that exists within facts, really. And in the Factitious exhibition, artists are working within a spectrum of fact and fiction. And I hope that if you haven't already, that you'll take the time to head over to transy.edu/Morlan to check out that exhibition. But both within the exhibition and what we'll soon hear from Jason, what I think is important to keep in mind is that fiction plays a really important role in our belief systems and within our emotions and how we come to internalize information. And that facts give us a direction to understand that information, and that seeking out accurate source material and recognizing bias is really important to give us a kind of foundational understanding. And then it's really about the interactions between the facts and the fictions that raise interesting questions and discourse and speculations as things go on from there. So now I want to just turn it over to Jason and give him some time to talk all about it.
Thank you, Anthony. And let me go ahead and share my screen here. I want to thank Anthony and also all of the participating artists in this exhibit. It really is a fascinating piece that if you haven't checked it out, I hope that you'll get a chance to do so. And I'm thrilled that, to have the opportunity to talk about all of this in the library context, to give you all an idea of how at least one profession of information professionals kind of treat this whole question. So I'll start it off. I like to use this article that I found several years ago, and it talks about, it kind of jokingly asks the question, how the internet ruined everything, or did it? And as it turns out, it's not too hard to find articles that talk about how toxic the internet culture is. There are entire thought pieces related to this notion that smartphones have, destroyed a generation. But when you kind of dig into the problem of fake news and misinformation, yes, it's easier to share misinformation, much easier to share information now in the age of social networking. But it's not an entirely new concept. So you can see the writer here, she's writing for a newsletter actually called JSTOR Daily. And this will be my first plug for Transy Library Services. If you don't already know, and you're not part of the Transy community, I presume most of you in this room are, we have a lot of JSTOR content. And the JSTOR Daily newsletter is a really great read. It will put you into contact with a lot of these primary sources. and bring in timely topics from the news, as this writer, Alexandra Samuel, has done. This piece in particular dates back several years to shortly, obviously, after the 2016 election. You can see that she's writing about the 2016 election. But what she does in this piece that I think is really interesting is she explores these, the antecedents for so-called fake news. And she gets into discussion of yellow journalism and publications that were put out around the turn of the 20th century by such titans of journalism as, or publishing, I should say, as William Randolph Hearst. And I really thought this quote was interesting because here we have, an example of someone back in 1898 talking about how the public is tired of fake news. And in this piece, the writer ties together this weariness that the public has for sensationalized news, what they refer to here as fake news and fake extras. And we see actually a rise in more reliable publications like the New York Times. Now, it's not the only factor, of course, that plays into that. And she even says, and you can see in this slide, to tie those two things together directly is, really oversimplifying the argument. But I think that it's worth noting that people have been tired of fake news or information sources they can't rely on for a really long time. So while I have been hearing more from professors in the last few years about, we talk to my students about fake news and how to evaluate information sources, the problem doesn't start in 2020 or even in 2016. It goes way back. And librarians are one of several classes of professionals to kind of be on the front lines of helping people evaluate information sources so that so they can make better and informed decisions. So I had a few examples from the last few years this is from a few years ago. This is the Courier Journal taking to their social media. And it's very much in the way that former Governor Matt Bevin did during his administration. He tried to use his platform to speak directly to the people. He was known for not giving a lot of interviews to the press, instead going to direct videos to get his message across. And so the newspaper responded to this by, telling the governor, go forth and spin no more. We're going to basically annotate your video since you wouldn't come to us kind of in our terms, on our house. We'll go to you and annotate these things and sort of spin the facts out as we see them. Along with that, we've seen the current president use his platform, and kind of in the same way that rather than having his message filtered through the media, he would prefer oftentimes to use his own, social media platform, as many of us do, in fact. And so within the first year of Trump's administration, I believe it was counted over probably 100 times that Trump uses the term fake news. And so the point that I wanted to make here, not picking on any one particular politician or one party even, is that this notion of presidents and other officials in high office complaining about the news coverage that they get it's as old as as time. It's not a new problem, and in fact, it's not even a partisan problem. And I wanted to bring in this data here from the Pew Research Center. They do really some excellent work, and some of you in the room will be familiar with their work. They have a whole series of polls and reports that they refer to as their People in the Press series. They also have a whole series of polls that they do just on the internet and on digital culture. But I found this one really interesting, and what it says to me is that it doesn't matter if a person identifies as conservative or as liberal, they self-identify as a Republican or a Democrat. People, generally speaking, have about the same base knowledge of science topics. So we have a number of topics in our current national discussion, global warming being one of them. you know, it can be very easy for just about any of us, depending on where we sit on the political spectrum, to say, well, those other people, they don't know what they're talking about. You know, they're so misinformed, and they're, you know, they're so susceptible to the fake news item or the sensationalized news item. As it turns out, though, when you do more searching and, you know, kind of research into this, it really depends on where we are in the political spectrum as to what kind of misinformation we're more likely to fall for. So some people will be more inclined to believe, you know, medical misinformation, for example, quackery, you know, bad science. Others will say global warming is a hoax. And it really, it depends on one's worldview as to what kind of misinformation they're going to fall for. So I say that misinformation and fake news is not a partisan problem in the least. I see it as a human problem. And we'll delve into that a little bit later here. So we were talking actually in one of the online discussions that we had between the transy community. And we were, I believe it might have been brought up by our new president, Brian Lewis, pardon me, who talked about these articles that we see a few times a year about this is the new word in the dictionary this year. And so as I was thinking about this notion of post-truth, it definitely has its own antecedent in this notion of truthiness. For those who watched the Colbert Report on Comedy Central, I believe the show started in 2004 or 2005. It ran for about a decade. And Colbert coined this phrase, this word, truthiness. And you can see how it's defined here by no less than Merriam-Webster, who I believe it was in 2006, chose the word truthiness as their word of the year. And I was, when I was doing research for this talk, they actually earlier this year added the word to the dictionary. So in April of 2020, you can now go to the Merriam-Webster website. You'll see this definition, and truthiness is defined, the truthful or seemingly truthful quality that is claimed for something not because of supporting facts, but a desire for it to be true. And that leads us to this notion of post-truth, that we very much are in a post-truth era. And this definition comes to us from the OED. Your Transy library has a subscription to the OED, so check it out. But several years ago, the term post-truth was added to the OED with this similar kind of definition. Again, we're getting back to relating to things that we wish to be true, that we want to be true, that facts that confirm our own information bias rather than actual factual information. So we very much do live in a post-truth era. So enter librarians who have been trying to tackle this problem for many decades. And again, as I've said, while I tend to hear from students and professors more about this in the last few years, we've actually gone back decades. We've been developing this notion of information literacy and trying to explore its importance in the modern context. And I think it goes to the heart of what we're trying to do actually with a liberal arts education. And maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit later. But the term information literacy is attributed to the person's name that you see here on the screen, this Paul Zurkowski. And forgive me for reading a longish quote here, but I want to just spell all this out for you. So in 1974, Zurkowski he is heading up the Information Industry Association, and he's widely credited with coining the term. And he gave a report to the National Commission on Libraries and Information Studies, and he stated in that report, information is not knowledge. It is concepts or ideas which enter a person's field of perception, are evaluated and assimilated, reinforcing or changing the individual's concept of reality and or ability to act. As beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so information is in the mind of the user. So we have, this concept is now beginning to be fleshed out a little bit. 2 years later, in 1976, There's a writer in a professional publication for librarians called American Libraries. A writer by the name of M.R. Owens wrote what you see here. I want to say about this particular quote, I believe very strongly in this notion of the application of information resources being vital when it comes to fulfilling one's civic responsibilities. And again, we tie that to what we're trying to do with liberal education and educating the whole person. I do have a problem with the first part of the quote here, where we refer to some people as information illiterates. Some of us are less informed than others. What I would say is that we're not helpless in the cause. And so those of us in libraries and in other professions that are trying to combat misinformation and fake news believe very strongly that we have a set of tools that we can use. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later here. But just kind of following the timeline again, the development of information literacy as a concept. In 1989, we have the formation of the American Library Association's Presidential Committee on Information Literacy. It is one of a number of recommendations that are put out by that committee that the National Forum on Information Literacy is formed. That's actually an umbrella organization of about 90 groups that are devoted to combating misinformation. In 1998, the American Association of School Libraries, which is the, I guess, kind of like the K-12 division of libraries in our country, published this paper, The Information Power, Building Partnerships for Learning. Then in 2009, October of that year, President Barack Obama declares National Information Literacy Month, which highlights the importance of information literacy on a national scale, not just among librarians and other professionals, but making it a priority for the country. And then in 2016, we see the Association of College and Research Libraries, which is the higher ed division of the American Library Association. They basically re-articulate their framework for information literacy. They had come out with standards for information literacy about a decade or a decade and a half before this. But what happens in 2016 is that they rescind those earlier recommendations, and they say basically that information literacy really is kind of more in a framework of understanding and not just a set of heuristics that we check a box. And so and when we are working in the library classroom, we're very much informed by the work of the ACRL and other organizations that have helped to form this framework. So when you're in the library classroom with myself and probably more likely my colleagues Helen and Beth, they're actually tying the learning objectives for the library session to this framework in a lot of cases. So we've identified the problem of misinformation, of fake news, and we've talked a little bit about the history of it. So what are we going to do about it? Well, I've got two sort of broad things that I want to cover here. One is talking to students in describing misinformation in kind of in large buckets, if you will. Misinformation really can take on a lot of forms, and you can see here in my bullet points, it seems like a duh moment to say, yeah, misinformation is truth, it's untruthful, it's false, it's fake news, whatever. But as we know, it can take different forms. It can be, because of that, it can be hard to identify a lot of times. So when we go into the other sort of flavors of misinformation, we have disinformation. This is information that is deliberate in nature. So it's put out there as deliberately to deceive people. When I talk to students about this in the library classroom, I will talk to them about, say you got an email from a family member and they forwarded some information to you. They probably weren't trying to actively disinform you. There's a certain fact out there that could be checked somewhere online that they just failed to do. And so they're just passing on misinformation in kind of a benign way. That's probably the form that most of our misinformation takes. With disinformation, the person delivering the information is trying to deceive the person receiving the information. And it's also true that it's often more than just a one-off. This can be an ongoing campaign, a strategy to misinform either a particular individual or a group of people. Again, we'll get into the purpose of information in just a minute, but as we'll find out, a lot of the information that we take in on a daily basis is there for a particular purpose. It's not just there to, inform people. So then we get into propaganda as another just kind of large, group of misinformation that's out there. A lot of times we have talked about propaganda in the framework of political parties. We could talk about, for example, certain repressive governments nowadays. Belarus is very much in the news. Other examples that I've seen in the library classroom would be China, North Korea. There's actually an example that I used to use, and it's a little old now, but the North Korean government under the last regime, under Kim Jong-il, there was actually a piece in Golf Digest magazine of all places. And the writer who produced this talked about going to a golf course in Pyongyang, and the people who ran the club were telling him about how Kim Jong-il had all of these holes in one. We're led to believe he's the greatest golfer of all time. And it seems like a kind of a funny thing to lie about, but when you bring up an example like this, you can talk to students about, now, why would the North Korean government want to do that? What is the purpose? What's the end game here? Obviously, it's to make him look stronger, to make him look invincible. And perhaps they think in Western culture, okay, golf's a popular game. Let's claim that our, national leader is the best golfer that ever was, and that somehow, would elevate his status. So the thing that's tricky about propaganda is often there's a lot of truth that's weaved into this narrative that are being fed by the people who are promulgating this misinformation. And so it can be more insidious than the other forms of misinformation just because of the very nature of that misinformation. So those are just three kind of broad categories that we can talk about with misinformation. When I think about some of the professors in the room, you can actually get into discipline-specific kinds of misinformation, right? If you're a biology professor or somewhere in the allied health professions, you can talk about medical misinformation, medical quackery. If you are a communication studies professor or journalism, you can talk about fake news. So this to me, this is a framework for talking about misinformation, kind of opens the door to a multidisciplinary approach. Another thing that we will do in the library classroom is apply a set of heuristics to evaluating an information source. Now, back in the day when I started this, this particular test that I'm going to talk to you all about today was developed back in 2004. The person who's credited with developing this is Sarah Blakesley, is her name. Her and her colleagues at California State University, Chico, developed this sort of framework for evaluating an information source. When I started teaching information evaluation a number of years ago, we would often use a print source of information, like a book, like a dictionary. Now, of course, in the internet age, it's actually very relevant to assign students websites to evaluate. And one thing that I always tell students when we go through these 5 criteria, these are the same criteria that your librarians are using when we are curating a print collection for you to use in the library. At Transy, of course, we tour students through the library. I hear the student docents all the time talking to prospective students about how there's 100,000 volumes in the general stacks. We're using these very same criteria, currency, relevance, authority, and so on, when we're deciding what books are appropriate for our print collection. I also tell students that your professors are making the same decisions about information sources in their specific professions. So we talk about currency, for example, and I'm going to go to notes here again so I can be a little more complete in my remarks. This, of course, refers to the timeliness of the information. And it's really important, particularly when we're talking about websites, to explore when information was published or posted. A lot of times information can be factual, and you see this in social media a lot, that a story is shared as though it's a new piece of information when in fact it's not. It's actually a couple of years old. So currency is really important, particularly in our information, our digital information age that we all kind of work in and survive in. Relevance just really speaks to the importance of information for your specific need. This is a little bit harder to cover in the library classroom because we're not necessarily making an evaluation about the information itself. It really goes more toward your specific question. So we can ask things like, does the information relate to your topic or answer your questions? Who is the intended audience for this information? We can ask things like that. Authority is a really important one, obviously, and this is very important to us in higher education because, who is putting the information out? I use the example sometimes in the library classroom of anti-vaxxer types who sometimes when you kind of dig into their background, they may be a person of some note or notoriety, but do they actually have a medical background? So the authority of the person is really important. So who is the author? What's the source? What's the author's credentials? A lot of times with a peer-reviewed piece, that we teach in higher ed, we expect to see they earned their doctorate or their other terminal degree somewhere. Are they actually qualified to write on the topic? And then along with that, what does the URL, if you're evaluating a website, what does the URL tell you about the information source? Is the article you found hosted at an edu website or is it at a .com or so on? The accuracy of the information, and this is kind of where the gut test comes in, okay? So the reliability, the truthfulness, the correctness of the content. We can ask questions here like, is the information actually supported by evidence? Are there other sources that are cited in this? And we talk to students about that a lot in the library classroom, that you never just go on one piece of information. You always want to verify that in multiple sources whenever possible. Has the information been reviewed? Peer reviewed, of course, is important in our higher ed context. Can you verify the information from another source and so on? And then finally, the purpose, and I alluded to this earlier. There's a reason why the information is out there, and it's very rare that information is out there simply for the goodness of informing the public. Usually, the person or the organization that puts this information out wants you to do something. They want you to take some action. And so what is that specific action, and what does that say about the information that they're putting out there? So we can ask questions, about are the authors of this information making their purpose clear? Are they being upfront about that? We can ask things like, does the point of view that's being expressed in that information, does it appear objective and impartial? Sometimes yes, sometimes not. Are there political, ideological, cultural, personal biases? And again, we all have information biases, biases, I should say. So that becomes important as we are evaluating information for our own needs. Another thing that I have done in some sessions before I wrap up here and let Anthony say a few more words is I found a great chart online a few years ago that takes about 24 information sources and plots them on an X and Y axis. And if I'd been on my game, I would have showed it to you today, but it basically tries to, it's one person's understanding of this rich kind of information ecosystem that we exist in. And the person who put this together tries to plot all of the information sources, let's say NPR, CNN, Fox News. This person tries to plot them all kind of left, right, according to how liberal or conservative they are perceived to be, but also on the vertical axis, it has to do with how much in depth we believe the information, the content itself to be. And I like showing a chart like that to students because even though it's one person's conception of all of these different information sources, I think that we all kind of do that in our minds anyway. We all tend to trust certain information sources more than others. And so that's where information bias comes in. We need to be aware of it. So as in years past, when I would take students to the stacks and show them a book, I would tell them, this organization, if you didn't already know, tends to have a reputation for being, a little right of center or a little left of center. It's not that the information that is contained there is invalid. It's just something to be aware of, and to be aware of where the writer or where the producer of that content is coming from. So you can see here on this slide, these are some of the things that I try to accomplish when I'm in the midst of an information evaluation session with students at Transy. And so just keep in mind, for the professors in the room who already know this, when you do bring your classes in, and we touch every FYS and FYRS course pretty much at Transy, information evaluation is going to be just one of the units that we're trying to cover in the 50 minutes or the minute and hour and 15 that we have. So this tends to move quickly. And I know I can speak for all my colleagues when I say that we try to keep it engaging. We try to make sure that we include some kind of active learning, and so that the students are actually engaged during the session. And to the degree that professors can be a part of that, not just being present for the session, but also interjecting with their own thoughts and questions, it always makes the session go better and richer. It's a better experience for the student. And so with that, I want to thank everyone I'll stop sharing at this point. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and thank you for the interest in the topic, and welcome your thoughts and questions. And I want to let Anthony have a few more words about this excellent digital exhibition that he's curated. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jason. That was super informative and really interesting. One of the things that struck me during your talk just now is that purpose point within the CARAAP. And that I think that within the arts, and especially, the artists that are in the exhibition, the Factitious exhibition, is that the purpose is really to push the boundaries and push on the edge of the facts within their work. And so when I think of somebody's work, like Beauvais Lyons, who's is in the exhibition, and he'll be talking also in October, is his work is looking at kind of the naturalists and responding to someone like Audubon, who we have in our collection, in our special collection, and then using that same kind of language same kind of visual language to create fictional animals and then present them in a real way, right? And so they become these kind of fun and enjoyable things, but also they have reference to something that is built within myth as well, right? And myths have always been a way that we as human beings have developed our belief structures, have explained things that are unknown. So they kind of stood in at one point, really, as facts in and of themselves. They were like, this is how we understand the world, right? And so what's interesting to me is that as we go along and we gain more information, in fact, develop over the course of time, but we still have these kind of like built-in systems of understanding that rub up directly against the facts that we know, right? And so I guess I find that interesting. I think that there's a number of artists within the exhibitions that are doing that. So I would ask everyone who's watching today, to go and check out the exhibition. And when you're looking through the work, really kind of think through, how is it that the artists are using entry points of facts or entry points of what it is that is commonly understood, and then how is it that emotions or beliefs are interacting within that space with those facts? Because I think that that's really some interesting territory that the artists in the exhibition are working with. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. We can also just go to the chat for questions.
Yeah, I was looking here at the question that's posed by Tim Collins. Hi, Tim. And you asked the question about social media. There's a lot to cover here, depending on what direction you want to go in. As one is a regular consumer of social media, as I suspect most of us are, I guess generally I would say I don't think the companies are doing very well. They, we know about foreign interference, for example, in the last couple presidential cycles, a very real problem. And Facebook in particular, I think, has been very slow to respond to the very real problem of pretty much its platform being turned into a disinformation machine. So I kind of, I will joke with people sometimes, I'm really there for the pictures of my niece, but what I feel like I see all the time are kind of specious, pieces of information and how much truth is there. The platforms have begun, and I know that you all have probably read articles related to this. They have begun to have their own internal procedures for reviewing content and also occasionally flagging it as misinformation. And famously, there have been several prominent politicians who have had their tweets actually actually called out as this is not factual information. I don't know how much that is going to mitigate the problem, given that these are for-profit entities. Both Twitter and Facebook are publicly traded companies. We probably have an economics professor at Transy that could speak more to that than I can. But I think the profit motive, I worry that as an information person, I worry that the profit motive is probably more important to these companies, at least some of the time, than making sure that we are using our technology in an ethical way. There's a new Netflix documentary, a docudrama that was released recently that I got to see, and it basically covers, they talk to a number of the engineers of products like the Facebook like button, and just about to a person, all of the people that developed these tools are very worried about how they're being used. How they're being used to spread misinformation, disinformation, and so on. So there's a lot that we could talk about in the social media context, but I don't know. I would welcome any thoughts that any of the rest of you have about that. How do you, what do you do in your own practice to mitigate it? I have just really stopped getting a lot of my notifications. I use the snooze button liberally now. Particularly as things ramp up to the presidential election, I'm trying to read factual news sources more and rely on hearsay and what I see in social media much less. We all have our own strategies for doing that. So thank you for the question, Tim.
I'm going to jump in on that because when I think about the artwork, right, aspect of this is the artists they're inserting their work into the world as a way to raise questions. And I think with the particular challenge with social media is that the way in which information is being presented is directly corollary to what is fact-based. So the misinformation is standing in the same exact way that information that's fact-based is standing in. And so where an artist might create work that they know is going to raise questions and create a dialogue, the misinformation is standing in specifically to change somebody's mind towards a specific intended outcome, right? And that there's no separation between whether or not that's existing within a fact-based space or whether that's existing as a misinformation-based space. And so I guess what I'm happy to see is starting is that there's the flagging of this information, right? But that's only really been very recent that things like Twitter are starting to put something a fact checker on information. And you can't possibly do that with, billions of different users. So I think that that's really a challenge that they've set up for themselves within these systems.
Absolutely. Carol asks a really good question, which is who gets to hold the facts? And One thing that I did not cover in my talk that I actually had set out to do, I'm sorry about that, is there are a number of fact checkers that you can go to. Now, there's a couple that I like probably more than others. The PolitiFact is one. I can't remember if that's the one that one of them is sponsored by the Annenberg Public Policy Center, which does some excellent work. It might be PolitiFact that's actually run by the Tampa Bay Times, which is an excellent newspaper, a nonprofit entity, and they do a really good job of reviewing the claims that are made largely by politicians and other prominent figures. So Snopes is an old school one that you can go to online, and that actually, when I used to get the chain mails back in the day, I would often Snopes would be one of my first stops. It's funny sometimes when you're trying to debunk the claims that are being made, it's like, why would a person make up a story about Formosan termites being in the mulch, at Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever? Like, what do they have to gain by saying that? But you can go to these websites. They can help you debunk, and some of them really get into the details about a particular claim. They will show you the better written articles about the better written fact checks, I should say, will actually take you into the into the story, and will show you, well, this particular claim that was made, there was some truth to it. This particular claim that's being made by the writer is false. Again, we get into that blurring line, and what's not solely fact or fiction, it's more factitious than the two. And so, you can get to some of those websites that will help you separate that out. There's no one keeper of the facts, obviously. This is a short answer to your question. We all have information biases. What we can try to do in the context of a liberal education, at least I imagine that's what I'm helping do as a librarian. I'm helping the student get a fuller picture and to develop and to confront their own information biases, which are often wrapped up in social, cultural, other issues. Can you confront your information biases? First, you have to acknowledge that information bias is a thing, but then you can begin to combat it. You can begin to take action from there.
So Julie has a question of what are the thoughts on managing the ethics of being an information creator, because within her own personal work, she's doing a lot with community efforts on social media to sway opinion, and that really emotional appeals seem to be far more effective than fact-based appeals. And I guess what I would say to that is I agree 100% that an emotional appeal is going to sway an opinion, of course, much more than a fact-based appeal. And I think that that's because inherently, as human beings, we are innately emotional creatures. And I had read this article by Yuval Noah Harari about how we are post-truth species, and that it's really built within us. So going all the way back to the origins of what it is to be human beings, and that because we are storytellers, and we develop our belief systems from those storytellings, we are really post-truth right from the very beginning. And so with that in mind, I think that speaks to the point of why it is that it's easier to sway someone's opinion through emotion than it is through fact, because it's really evolved with us over time to always have our belief structures about the world be tied to emotions and storytelling. Tim S., what do you think?
I'm sorry. I think Carol makes a good point here about how it takes, she writes, it takes great courage to turn one's back on your community and family. And I think that's true. You know, again, our information biases, I think, are tied to all of these other factors. You know, our own biology certainly being one of them, but you know, who we are and who we represent in the culture is huge. And groupthink, you know, is very much a thing. And social media really amplifies all of that, unfortunately. So that's a great quote, Zoe. Thank you.
Yeah.
Never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
So that puts us at about 1 o'clock. So we should probably be wrapping up. I'm going to put a link to that article that I just referenced here in the chat in case anyone wants to check it out. But I also just want to thank you, Jason, for the wonderful talk. Thank everyone for being here today and contributing to the conversation.
Thank you all. I certainly appreciate all the comments.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got some good feedback today, so I'm glad people got something out of it. So